Coming up on Need to Know, it's referred to by some as an invisible disability. A look at a disease with no known cure affecting the lives of millions around the globe, including some people in our community. What you need to know about it and the stories of those who refuse to be defined by it. That's next. Also on the show, we'll learn about a first-of-its-kind robot created by a college student in an effort to revolutionize hospitality. And she's been called a source of tough love by local teens, some of whom once had been on the verge of dropping out of high school. Meet our new American Graduate Champion. It's all coming up right now on Need to Know. Writer Joan Didion, former talk show host Montel Williams, and actress Teri Garr all have it, as did renowned comedian Richard Pryor. I'm talking about the millions of people around the world affected by multiple sclerosis. It's been called an unpredictable and potentially disabling disease. MS is defined as a chronic disease that attacks the central nervous system. We're talking about the brain, the spinal cord, and optic nerves. So how is this invisible disability, as it's sometimes referred to, affecting the lives of people in our own community? How are area residents living with MS working to not be defined by their condition? Today, we're carrying out a WXXI initiative launched back in 2003 with the Al Siegel Community of Agencies. It's called Dialogue on Disability, and it's focused on initiating community conversation about the perspectives and abilities of people with physical and intellectual disabilities. Joining me for today's conversation is Susan Toussaint, a Rochester area resident living with MS. Dr. Andrew Goodman, director of the Multiple Sclerosis Center at the University of Rochester, and Dee Mascari, programs and services manager of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society Upstate Chapter. And welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining me today. So I've heard osteoporosis, pancreatic cancer, and thyroid cancer all referred to as the silent disease. And I'm curious, why is multiple sclerosis also referred to as the silent disease or the invisible disability? And Dr. Goodman, I'll give that to you.
Well, as in real estate, location matters a great deal. And in MS, the location, as you mentioned, that the disease hits is the central nervous system, and in particular, the brain. And certain parts of the brain, because of their location, are less eloquent in their manifestation, so that either the person who's diagnosed with MS and the people around them are not necessarily aware of how much damage is being done by the disease.
And I've also read that MS is among the most difficult of diseases to diagnose. Is that true? And if it is, why?
Well, just for this very reason, that often it's silent in its initial effects. But fortunately, in the past 3 decades or so, we've developed increasingly sensitive magnetic resonance imaging, so-called MRI techniques, which are quite effective and sensitive at helping the diagnosis of MS. We still need a doctor and a patient to talk and discuss what the symptoms are, and put that together with MRI information and sometimes some other tests, including analysis of cerebrospinal fluid, to get to a diagnosis. But it can sometimes take years to arrive at a definitive diagnosis.
So Susan, tell us a little bit about your story. When were you first diagnosed, and were you aware of MS and its symptoms at that time?
Well, my father had MS. But he died of a heart attack before his MS really went much of anywhere. And I was actually diagnosed before MRIs. So it was a symptom, and apparently my lumbar puncture was not positive, it was negative. So it was symptomatic, my description of losing my vision when I ran, and reacting in other ways to heat, which it often affects people with MS. But in my support group, I'd say everybody has the story of their journey to diagnosis. You know, I thought I might have had a stroke because all my symptoms were on my right side. Other people are in the hospital and, you know, have different diagnoses, brain tumor, cancer. Everybody has a story of how they got there.
What are some of those symptoms? Susan mentioned some. What are some that you find patients come to you describing?
Well, since the central nervous system essentially controls all aspects of vision and movement, these are generally the areas that are typically symptomatic. So as in Susan's case, somebody may lose vision either temporarily while they're overheated or more permanently, unfortunately. People will also have difficulty sometimes with walking or movement in general, with balance, again, because the nervous system controls all these functions. So I would say that the most typical symptoms that people will have initially will be some degree of visual impairment, some numbness in the limbs, and also weakness or difficulty walking. Those are, I would say, the commonest presentations.
Dee, question for you. So with the Upstate New York chapter, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, it looks as though it's this one-stop shop, essentially, in terms of providing different types of resources and supports to individuals. What are some of those initial questions, fears that people may have when they first come to you after diagnosis that you're hearing and that you work to help support?
Well, I think often people think they're alone, that they're the only person that this is happening to. And with the unpredictability of the disease, not being able to plan their future, not being able to plan day to day sometimes, in ways, you know, we support people in ways to give them resources, emotional support groups, self-help groups. We do service management, care management to help people connect with the tools that will help them live their best life with MS.
I want to make sure that viewers have a sense of what exactly the symptoms are, what attacks are triggered for people living with MS. I came across in my reading, in my preparing for this conversation, one retired physician and a surgeon described the recurring attacks of inflammation of the central nervous system as this. It's like your body is fighting an all-out war with a dangerous intruder that doesn't exist. How accurate is that statement, and what are people feeling living with this?
Yeah, so what I think is being referred to in that description is what's called autoimmunity. So the immune system normally protects us from infections, but in the case of MS, it's actually harming the central nervous system, and it causes in an attack. An attack is really inflammation or irritation of the nervous system, and in particular, there's an insulating tissue called myelin that seems to be the main target of inflammation. And when that happens, again, if the optic nerve happens to be the location that's affected, then vision will be dim or absent. If it hits the spinal cord, it may affect sensation or movement of the limbs. And so in each one of those events, there is an inflammatory attack. It doesn't necessarily happen at a single location. It may happen at multiple locations, not often simultaneously, but it can happen. But over time, it tends to skip around and disseminate into multiple locations, optic nerve, spinal cord, brain, as you've heard. And all these areas may have varying degrees of acute to chronic inflammation. And that inflammation over time leads to scarring. And that's where the term sclerosis comes from, because that really refers to scarring of the nervous system. And once there's scarring, we generally think of the damage as permanent. And over time, over a period of decades, that scarring builds up in various places in the nervous system, and then that can lead to impairments and permanent disability.
So that's where the connection is. So I was going to ask you, where does it transition from a disease to a disease plus a disability? And it's at that point.
Well, when there's scarring in the nervous system that builds up, and we also think aging plays a role, and so over a period of decades, there's normal aging of the nervous system that all of us have to try to compensate for, but that's much more difficult in the setting of multiple scars that have built up over those decades as well.
Susan, talk about how do you believe that this has impacted your life, or impacted your work, the things that you wanted to do, or do you feel as though you've still been able to accomplish a lot of those things?
Well, I think I was diagnosed in 1980, and I can look back to 1974 and see some definitive signs that probably could have been diagnosed then. So we're talking, how many years is that? 41 years. So when I think about what life was like before MS, I kind of wonder, was there life before MS? Or, you know, were there things that were happening before that? And I guess I've been pretty fortunate. I have primary progressive, which most people used to thought you would just kind of crash and burn. Now it can be gradual over years. I never had any attacks, per se. So diagnosis was a little more difficult. Actually, I broke my hip training for Bike MS. Yes, and that's actually, I think, impacted my life more than my MS has. But it gets complicated because, and it's people in my group say, you know, sometimes we say, oh, everything is MS. If you have an eye problem, oh, it's MS. But you can have a stroke if you have MS. And so then people will say, oh, it's not MS, it's something else. So I think part of it is figuring that out. You can have other things along with MS, then MS can make it worse, like with the aging, or the other thing can make your MS worse. And it's figuring those things out that I think a lot of times is frustrating.
You mentioned the support groups that are available, and something that you also previously told me, there's an MS service day that's offered 3 times a year, and individuals, they support individuals living with MS. I want to get a sense of what takes place and how this ties in with the work of the National MS Upstate chapter.
Sure. MS Service Day is a day where we send teams of volunteers out to homes of people who have MS, and they complete chores that the person may not be able to complete due to their MS, and it may not be that they physically can't do the chore. It may be that after working all day, one of the symptoms of MS can be extreme fatigue. So, you know, washing the windows are not high on their list. Getting dinner on the table and getting to bed is a good night. So that, you know, just to help people with MS get feel better about where they live, help them live independently in their home, and get some of those things done. And it's a great stress reliever for people with MS, and it's a wonderful day. The volunteers get just as much out of it as the people who they're serving.
I've read that this disease, and Susan, you mentioned this too, it can vary from person to person depending on the type of MS that one may be diagnosed with. And I've also read that women, it disproportionately affects women and whites. And I want to know, why is that, and what factors play into this? Environmental, genetic? Susan mentioned that her father had it. How do we know who's likely or who may be prone to getting this?
Yeah, so you've already hit on the answer. It's both genetics and environmental exposure. So it's very clear from a lot of work, much of which was sponsored by the National MS Society around the world, that the risk of getting MS in terms of genetics is all centered around genes that affect how the immune system works. And there are actually now over 150 genes that have been identified. So it's a complex thing. There isn't a single abnormal gene among the 150 or more that have been identified, but the pattern or the combination of genes that one inherits clearly puts people at a predisposition for getting MS. But what are the environmental factors? More and more we're interested in the possibility that low levels of vitamin D, particularly in a vulnerable time of life in adolescence or early adulthood, may predispose to MS. Another factor that's increasingly interesting is exposure to cigarette smoke. So these are just two of the environmental factors. We also believe that viruses, exposure to viruses at a particular age may have a role, and one of the viruses that's prominently considered is Epstein-Barr virus. This is the virus that causes mono in young adults. So we believe exposure to viruses, low levels of vitamin D, possibly exposure to cigarette smoke in the genetically susceptible individual conspires to cause MS. But we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle figured out, but these are some of them that we think are important.
Well, I want to talk about treatment, and I'm curious to know what is available. Are there any new breakthroughs that are, could be beneficial in terms of the treatment process? And Susan, how is treatment for you? What does that look like for you?
Well, actually, right now I'm in a clinical trial at the National Institutes of Health. I go next week for my wrap-up after 4 years. And they're looking at primary progressive MS and a variant of CoQ10. Kind of speculative, okay. But I also thought it was a good trial because CoQ10's pretty, didn't sound dangerous.
And that is, just in terms of clarification, CoQ10?
It would be like an anti-inflammatory. Okay. But there really aren't treatments for primary progressive. And I think there's some that are being developed and coming down the pipeline, and I think the MS Society's been a big funder of looking at both primary progressive and secondary progressive, which you may want to talk a little bit about.
So it sounds like treatment depends on the type of MS that one may be diagnosed with.
Yes. So I really think of them not so much as types, but as patterns that people experience. Okay. And the typical pattern that people experience, we already alluded to, starts out as attacks or flare-ups or relapses. Small areas of inflammation that again spread through various areas of the nervous system and build up over time. And this is about 85% or more of people with MS. So that's the typical pattern. Now, the pattern that Susan is talking about is what's called primary progressive MS. And that is no attacks, just little by little over a period of years, sometimes decades, gradual worsening. And then in between those two patterns is what we call secondary progressive MS. These are the people who start with the relapsing or relapsing-remitting form of MS, as I mentioned, in 85% of people, and then gradually over 10, 15, 20 years will evolve to have fewer attacks and more of this gradual worsening or progression of impairment and disability that we spoke about. So where the field has really had enormous advances in the past 30 years that both Susan and I have been aware of MS, is in preventing attacks. And we've had great success in this, and there are now, when I was still studying MS in the early 80s and you were first experiencing it, we had exactly 0 treatments, and now we have over a dozen. So that's a real big advance over the past couple of decades.
Is a cure on the horizon?
So cure is a tough word. Yeah. Even if we could cure the autoimmune process in let's say a 30-year-old woman, a person who's in their 40s and 50s who's had MS for 20 or 30 years, who's already accrued disability, that immunologic cure is not going to fix their nervous system. So cure is a complex term. We'd like to be able to do both, of course. We'd love to be able to prevent it, but absent being able to do that, we'd love to be able to control it completely. Let's call that, put it in remission, if not entirely cure it. And we'd love to be able to restore, repair, regenerate the damaged areas in the nervous system. We've come really close with our newer therapies for the immune system. We are beginning, and MS Society is promoting and sponsoring this, we're beginning to look at treatments that may actually repair the damage.
Well, a special thank you to my guests for joining me for this conversation. I appreciate it. And the segment was part of Dialogue on Disability Week. It's a partnership between WXXI and the Otsego Community of Agencies in conjunction with the Herman and Margaret Schwartz Community Series. Dialogue on Disabilities is supported in part by the Golisano Foundation with additional support from the Fred L. Emerson Foundation. You can check out a documentary about this week. It's called When I Walk. Filmmaker Jason DeSilva works to make sense of his life with MS. The film airs this Sunday afternoon. That's January 17th on WXXI TV at 2:30 p.m. A team of upstate New York inventors is hoping a new robot design can help improve the health of hotel maids and housekeepers who have a much higher injury rate rather than other service sector workers. This and the potential impact on jobs are explored as Sasha Ann Simons joins us now with more for WXXI's Innovation Trail.
Thanks, Helen. I'm sure I'm not alone when I say I could use a little robot to help me clean the house. But as for the pros, an invention like MaidBot could really make a difference. Studies by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration have found housekeepers are suffering arm, shoulder, and lower back injuries from performing highly repetitive tasks. And if the team behind MaidBot has its way, this robot is only the beginning of a clean sweep of helpful gadgets. Take a look.
You're the best, Rosie.
You betcha, Mr. J.
You can call it a modern-day Rosie the Robot.
Rosie is awesome but ugly. So the one thing that I think is beautiful is if you've ever seen the movie WALL-E, Eva, that robot.
Futuristic, minimal, and sleek. If 19-year-old entrepreneur Micah Green gets his way, a new housekeeping robot he created will be on the market by 2017. MaidBot is still in prototype stage, and once complete, Green says it will help take the hotel industry by storm.
It's been the same for like over 100 years. Like they've been doing, the biggest innovation in housekeeping has been the electric vacuum, which came out in 1905.
MaidBot will assist hotel housekeeping staff to clean the floors, and it will eventually make beds and help maintain the bathrooms. The team of 8 from Ithaca, New York, says the lightweight machine will do more than just save time. It'll save someone's neck. Literally.
Robotics in general focuses on dull, dirty, or dangerous tasks. So housekeeping encompasses all of those.
Studies show that maids and housekeepers have one of the highest injury rates in the hotel industry and in the entire private sector. Coming in at around 40%, back injuries are the most commonly reported, followed by pains in the hand and wrist and shoulder.
A lot of injuries aren't reported, and especially among this kind of workforce, because they're part-time workers, sometimes they're contract workers, and they're at risk of losing their jobs.
Grant Essler lectures about OSHA guidelines at Rochester Institute of Technology. He says ergonomic injuries are more subject to underreporting simply because they're not as obvious.
Musculoskeletal injuries are difficult to identify as work-related. I mean, it could happen, when you're playing softball or picking up your kid at home.
I find this fascinating. But how is this going to be able to clean my floor and make my bed?
So this is the first step in that direction, but this guy is going to focus on the floors, and essentially what we're doing here is we're creating the robotic vacuum where the impeller will be in the center, and then we'll have the intake.
MaidBot's omnidirectional wheels roll forward like normal wheels, but can slide sideways and won't skid when it turns. David Moriniti is in charge of the technology. This is the transmitter the team is using to test the product.
Now for traditional aircraft, when you use the throttle stick, you want to hold in a certain position. So if I want to go forward at a certain rate, I can leave it there.
MaidBot will make its rounds to a few hotels this spring, so staff can check it out. More than anything, the startup's boss says he wants his invention to make a real difference in people's lives.
We're not trying to just sell robots, we're trying to sell time. And if you just imagine the time that we could save by creating a product that does it for you, completely autonomously, to me that's amazing.
That was Sasha Ann Simons reporting for WXXI's Innovation Trail. And we transition now to this week's American Graduate Champion. The local champ works with at-risk youth in 5 Rochester City schools. She was nominated by a colleague who says her entire focus is always on what can help students graduate, which sometimes means working into the evenings and weekends to engage parents and families in each student's success. Susan Gunther is our American Graduate Champion. She's the director of Monroe Community College's Liberty Partnerships Program. It's a voluntary referral program for city school students facing a number of challenges at school or in the home. Take a look at what students had to say about Ms. Gunther and the role she played and continues to play in helping them achieve what they once thought was impossible. It's a typical day of after-school tutoring for these students involved with the Liberty Partnerships program, also referred to as LPP.
Bring it down.
The program was created by the New York State Department of Education to address dropout rates and increase graduation rates. It's been operating at Monroe Community College since 1989.
If it was an equation, how would you solve this?
And it's been under the direction of this woman, Susan Gunther, for the past 11 years.
We offer the tutoring plus the career exploration plus the college prep and community service projects and things like that. I think that's the array of services we provide. Plus it's a fairly small program, so there is opportunity to get a lot of one-on-one, case management help, personal counseling help, even help, filling out college applications.
Former LPP students like Abdul Bounds say while the program provided a wealth of support, it was Gunther who gave them what they really needed to succeed.
You have to make a commitment to yourself.
Having that mother figure and that love that I didn't get at home because of my parents were on drugs, and that love was still there because she showed me that, hey, no matter what's going on, you can still get you can still get where you need to get.
Every single student that walks through my door, that even though I've heard, oh, they get in trouble in school or this, everybody has potential, and everybody has potential that hasn't been tapped. And I think if, that's the message you relay to students, they can really pick up on that.
I was taught this saying, surround yourself by people who lift you higher, and she's one of those people who lift me higher, and I see that with my work and my grades and how my grades are improving and stuff.
Gunther maintains there's always room to improve in her work and that she's never been a fan of the status quo. But according to Abdul Bounds, now a student at MCC, Ms. Gunther is anything but status quo.
Without Ms. Gunther being there, I think I wouldn't have finished high school. I think I would have ended up like the rest of people in my neighborhood. I would have been on the corner selling drugs, or I would have been dead.
This segment was part of our ongoing Need to Know series called American Graduate Champions. We're highlighting individuals and organizations helping area kids succeed on the journey from preschool to graduation. To learn more, go to wxxi.org/grad. And that's it for this edition of Need to Know. I'm Helene Bianduti-Hofer. Thank you for tuning in tonight and throughout the weekend on WXXI TV. And be sure to check out the show or your favorite stories from this week's episode online. Just go to WXXInews.org and click on the Need to Know link at the top of the page. Have a good night.